Good morning.
Good morning, Willard.
It is the 29th of September, 2019. I am Willard Spiegelman, representing the James Merrill Committee. I'm here with the poet Mary Jo Salter at 107 Water Street in Stonington, the house of James Merrill. Last night, Mary Jo gave a luminous reading, performance, lecture to a responsive, receptive crowd of 100 people, including students and citizens of the borough of Stonington and people from far and wide, here at the La Grua Center. And she is now I believe, the 14th annual Merrill lecturer. Previous lecturers in this series have included a whole rash of very important, well-regarded writers: Louise Glick, Kay Ryan, Jory Graham, Laurie Moore, all Pulitzer Prize winners, scholars like Lanny Hammer from Yale and Stephen Yenser from UCLA, all of whom have talked about both their own work and their connections to, some of whom had personal connections to the late James Merrill. So let me ask Mary Jo to start, what is it like being back in this village, in this house, after some years? You have been to this place before. You knew James Merrill a little bit as a man. You read him and admired him as a poet. What is the feeling like of being back here now?
One of the things that happens anytime you go back to a place after a long period is that it seems to have shrunk. This is, to use a word you just used, it is a luminous place. It is shimmering with his intelligence and his sense of fun. As I look at this bat wallpaper, for example, that appears in the changing light at Sandover, but all of the rooms are smaller than I remembered. The kitchen, the study where he worked. The only really large space is upstairs, which I've been told is the highest. Am I right? The highest point in Stonington.
I believe so.
From which we can see all the boats out in the water, and that is a truly expansive feeling. But to be back here is to realize how concentrated a life he lived. That he was here writing and thinking and wanted this enclosure in some way.
He liked intimacy, and the study that I'm looking at through the door here is a womb-like space. And one of the interesting things about Merrill, and we know this from his friends and his biographers, is that although he never had a job in his life, being born a wealthy person, he worked harder than anybody else.
Yeah.
And everybody who was ever a house guest said that they would wake up in the morning and come down. Jimmy would already be at his desk or working, having been up for several hours. So he was a kind of nonstop worker.
Yes.
And somebody said, there's a story, maybe this is true, maybe it's not, it sounds good anyway. Somebody said he came down one morning and Jimmy said, "Here's a poem I've just written." And the person, a good reader, looked at it and said, "Well, this is nice, but it's a little cold. I don't think there's too much feeling in it." And Jimmy smacked his forehead and said, "Oh, I knew I forgot to put something in." And then he walked upstairs and sort of revised the poem and brought it back down with more feeling.
Yeah, wow, yeah. Well, that was also a generous soul, a person who would give you credit for what he had just done. You know, I mean, he was a generous person and a tremendously fun person. And so that balance between the hard worker who clearly was spending a lot of time writing and revising and sort of the party person, somehow they came together. And that's partly because, and of course I'm not the first to say this, many people have said it, is that the Ouija board trilogy that he was writing was effectively a party with the dead, you know. And
That's right.
It really was, you know.
He was consummately polite, and this is part of his upbringing as a society boy. Yes. And he was the master of the thank you note.
Absolutely.
And postcards. You
Yes.
know, the smallest gesture would elicit from him
Yeah.
a wonderful, savable piece of paper. Tell the story that you mentioned last night about being at the Frost Colony with him.
Oh, yes. This
New
was
Hampshire.
the Frost Place in Franconia, New Hampshire, which had, in 1981, when I was a young poet who was allowed to live there for the summer, he came and gave a reading. There was a reception. As I remember, it was Hawaiian Punch. And we sat around and talked on Frost's porch for a little while. And then he turned to the organizer and said, "It just couldn't have been nicer." And as I said last night, it was as if caviar had been served. I mean, he just was such a gentleman and made everyone feel that they were special.
I remember I brought him to Dallas to talk at SMU in 1982, and I was a nervous host, as hosts tend to be.
Yeah.
What do we do with the great man? Where do we take him? And there was to be a dinner or something, and he had arrived early, and I thought, well, we'll go out for a drink beforehand. And I took him to a place which was then very chic, but it was only, I didn't realize this, it was a wine bar. It was called La Cave. And we walked in, and we were going to have some nibblies and something to drink, and Jimmy said, "I think I'd like a scotch." And the waitress said, "I'm sorry, we don't have liquor here, we only have wine." And Jimmy paused, and I can imagine some people being huffy. He said, "Oh, well, let me just reimagine it then. So bring me a glass of red wine." So,
Reimagine.
right, he had his sights set on something, but then he had to be diverted in the other direction, and that was fine too.
Yes, yeah, and I remember because he was so mannerly. I still remember with some embarrassment. My then husband Brad Lighthouser and I visited Jimmy and David Jackson in Key West. I'm going to say this was 1985, and we brought our 2-year-old Emily, who is now herself, of course, a poet. It runs in the family, but we didn't know that then. What we knew is that Emily liked to run into the water, and so we'd already been on the shore, and she kept trying to run into the water. And then we came to Jimmy's house, and we were trying to sit out on the deck, and Emily kept trying to run into the pool. And I wrote, of course, afterwards a thank you note, and Jimmy wrote back a postcard and said something about. Oh, I know what he said. He said we've had some writers visiting, also some literary people, and then and then he said, "Has Emily acquired any of the social graces yet?" And it was only a couple weeks later. No, she had not. But.
What were your dealings with him like as a critic and reader and helper with your work?
I never sent him a poem for feedback. Even though I like to think I knew him pretty well, I didn't want to burden him with it. I'm sure he would have. And I was fortunate enough to receive an Ingram Merrill grant that his foundation had started. And so he was very much showing his support for my writing in that way, and in writing me very nice notes after my books were published. But no, I never sent him anything. And so it was a tutorial my tutorial from him was really reading him.
He never saw the poem that you read last night in response to his. That was a wonderful homage.
Oh, thank you. This poem of his, Fort Lauderdale, only appeared in, I guess it was 2001 when the collected poems came out, and he had written in 1976, and I didn't read it until after he died, but in it he's writing in Japanese tanka, and so about a tanker, and so I wrote a response to it of my own called Tanker.
A toy tanker.
A toy tanker.
It's interesting, isn't it, that he was so prolific that he had the luxury of saying, "Oh, we're not going to put that one in.
I know.
That one's not good enough."
I know. And as you and I were talking about this recently, that, we think we know his poems well, and we open up a particular volume and we go, that's amazing. I can't believe that I didn't remember that, and I didn't remember that effect. And that's partly because like all great poets, they do boil down eventually to some works that stick most in the public imagination. And beyond the Sandover trilogy, there are certain individual poems that are pretty much always anthologized and always should be. For example, Lost in Translation, which is just one of my favorite poems.
Days of 1964.
Absolutely.
One of the things about Merrill that I always found when teaching him is that he was capable of enormous depths of complexity, and he was also capable of total simplicity and childlikeness
Yes.
in some of the poems. So I would always begin by giving students very light poems, or what seemed to be immediately transparent poems. And you use them as the point of the wedge to open up the depths and the obscurities that came afterwards.
Yeah.
How did you become a poet? I mean, we know about Merrill because he writes about this.
Yeah.
Writing his first verses at the age of 5 and 6. Were you like that? Were you precocious?
I was. I mean, I think I was 7 when I first showed my parents a poem, and I've written about this somewhere. That I rhymed flowers and towers, and I remember getting a kind of feedback from my parents that this was, really an amazing thing. And my parents were very encouraging. I look back on
Was there literature in the house?
lots, yeah. And my mother loved to memorize poems, and so that came naturally to her. My father had dropped out of a PhD program at Berkeley in English to go into advertising, and he was a writer his whole life in a different way. I mean, first in advertising, and then he wrote some fiction, he wrote some poetry. He didn't publish, but he was serious about it. And my mother was a painter, and so there was an attitude in the family that, and my brother became a singer, that the arts were worth it, and that I think I was the luckiest, though. I was between 2 brothers, and I think, being born in the 50s and being a girl, there was less pressure on me than there might be on women today about how are you going to make a living. In the end, of course, I did make a living, but it was more about there is something you like to do. Why don't you do more of that?
Was there the unstated or stated suggestion that, of course, as a girl, you will go off to college and then you will marry well, and then you can be a Sunday painter or a Sunday poet or do whatever you want as long as you become a conventional mother?
No, that was really not it. My mother had been an art student, first in Chicago and then in New York, and she told me many times that her goal was to have her own one-man show, as she called it, before she was 25. And she didn't, and she married my father when she was 23 and became a mother of 3. And I think she really didn't want to be a Sunday painter, but that was gradually what was happening through my growing up. And so the great triumph of her life, which was too short, she died at 59, but was that at the very end of her life, she discovered that she liked to think in 3 dimensions. She became a clay sculptor, and she was a co-founder of something called the Baltimore Clay Works, and which still exists, I'm happy to say. And I think finally, having brought up her children and also knowing that she didn't have long to live, she became a full-time artist. And
Did she live long enough to see your first books come out?
No, she knew that my first book had been accepted, but it hadn't been published yet. And she saw my first child. She died when my first child was 6 months old.
So there was some gratification that came. That's good. That's good.
Yeah.
You were one of the people, the few and now mythic people who studied with Elizabeth Bishop at Harvard, and much has been said, much of it not very favorable, about Miss Bishop in the classroom. Were you one of her favorites?
I don't know, because she was so proper. She certainly was encouraging. Maybe I was one of her favorites because in those days, long before the internet, what were you going to do if you were too sick to teach? And so she called me up one morning and said, "This is Elizabeth Bishop, and I'm 19 years old, and why is Elizabeth Bishop on the phone?" And she said, "Would you tell the class that I'm ill today and I can't teach?" And so my greatest regret about not taking her encouragement enough to heart is that when I was about to graduate, she invited me to. She had a new apartment on the water in Boston, and she invited me to come and have tea. And I thought, she's Elizabeth Bishop. She couldn't possibly have meant that. So I never took her up on it. And she also, before I graduated, she said, you should really try to study with Robert Lowell. And I think she put in a good word. And I suddenly realized that I had to fulfill a history requirement. And I ended up not. I went to one of Lowell's classes, but I didn't take his class. And I ran into Bishop on the street, Miss Bishop on the street. And she said, "Why didn't you take that class?" And I explained about my history requirement. And I don't know even why I'm saying this on camera right now, because I'm so embarrassed that I didn't do everything that she told me.
It's interesting that 40 years ago, it wouldn't occur to you, or perhaps it would not have been possible at Harvard, to do something outrageous like petition for a different course or have this count for that, or to say, "I'll take an extra course."
Right. Who knows what my options were, but in any case, you're right. In those days, you sort of followed the line, and but I feel fortunate that I did at least see Lowell a couple of times and went to a reading. Another regret I have is that I didn't write down. That I wasn't keeping a diary. What was that? I remember that reading of Lowell's and her reading after Lowell died, her reading her elegy for him that ends, "Sad friend, you cannot change." And that was the last time I saw her.
This is the poem North Haven.
That's right. Yeah.
I can't imagine what he was like as a teacher. It would depend, I suppose, on the state of his mind and the chemical balance.
Yes, well, the one time I was there for his arriving in the first class, and I just came in, even though I wasn't part of the class. I just sat there waiting, and he was about 20 minutes late, and he looked very rumpled. He was in a seersucker suit, and he said to the class, "I'm very sorry I'm late, and I'm sorry I don't have any of your poems. I left them in the taxi." So that's how it began.
It can only go, I don't know, go down, go up.
Yeah, apparently I have a dim memory then of a student of students reading their work aloud without anyone else being able to look at them and his making comments. But
you are one of the rare, and now maybe one of the last people who could become a professional poet without being in an MFA program.
It's true. And I think the through line here between that time and this is that you're still not going to get a job teaching poetry if you haven't published a book. Mm-hmm. It may have changed that you need a MFA or a PhD, but if you have an MFA and a PhD and you don't have a book, you can forget it. And so, I'm always saying this to my students: write a book and then write another book. And
on the other hand, I know some young writers, I don't know whether they're poets, I certainly know some prose writers, who have a book, but they didn't have the credential of the MFA, so they had to go out, having already become published authors, and get this cockamamie degree just so they could have the stamp of approval. You are a Master of Fine Arts.
No, that's clearly wrong. And I, teaching in an MFA program at Hopkins, I've thought a whole lot about this, about what constitutes a right and just and realistic representation to students of what the career is and what it means. And I see it as an opportunity for somebody who already knows that they're a writer. They want to continue being a writer. Whatever happens, they're a writer, and a chance for 2 or 3 years to put all of your time into that, so that in times to come, when you have to balance that with a job, you have gotten your running start. There's nothing that's going to stop you, and I always say to my students that the day on which you hand in your thesis it's a completely arbitrary deadline. You're just going to keep doing it and getting better. I mean, ideally.
You have been at Hopkins for 10 years now?
12.
So you have been through, or you have instructed dozens of students. Mm-hmm. And have there been ones who have done you proud?
Oh, yes. And one of them was at the reading last night. He just graduated in 2019. His name is Armin Davoudian, and I think Jimmy would have loved him.
It's an Armenian name?
Yes, he is an Iranian of Armenian descent whose parents immigrated to California when he was 17, and he has a younger brother as well. And Armin somehow, although English was his third language, is working on his PhD in English at Stanford. He took 2 years out from that to get his MFA at Hopkins, and now he's back at Stanford. And his translations from the Persian and the whole. There, of course, there was a Merrill connection with he has both, Arabian Nights. He has the Arab connection, the Persian connection. He was very interested in Isfahan, etc. I mean, this is something, but also
the 1002nd night.
Exactly, but I think it's remarkable when you see students and I've had some very wonderful students, but it's remarkable when you see the ones who, like Armin, want to learn everything, want to read everything. They want to translate. They want to read critical work. They want to read biographies. There is no such thing as an assignment. That's the kind of student that will really become a writer. They self-assign all the time.
I had the feeling yesterday he and maybe a half dozen other students from Fisher's Island were here. They were there at a residency, which I didn't even know existed.
Yeah, Armin's the one who told me.
So they came here, and they had a tour of the room, the house in which we are sitting now. They seemed to be enchanted by everything. They were so happy and delighted to have had that chance.
Yes, and this was something that I can't overstress how important it was to me to have places to go away to write and get away from whatever my responsibilities were. So I know what it's like for those writers who are at Fisher Island right now. For me, it was primarily the MacDowell colony, which I went to the first time when I was 25. And I think I've been there 14 times. Just to completely seal yourself off from the world and have no responsibilities. And of course, in those days when I first went, there were 2 phone booths for the entire colony, and so there wasn't any danger of your being distracted by your iPhone,
there was no internet.
There's no internet. It was pretty glorious, yeah.
One of the things I know that the Merrill House and the committee and the fellowships do here is to provide mostly younger people with that opportunity to be here and to be part of a village and to be part of a community. Yes. You at MacDowell, you're out in the country, that's the woods. Mm-hmm. But this place is magical not only because it is the home of the person who has given us both his work and his other kinds of financial legacy, but also it's part of a community that welcomes and takes in the writers. So we've had many writers. I mean, I've lived here for only a year, and I've seen these people, and some of them say, no, I just want to write, but they're showered with invitations to come out and go sailing, have dinner, have lunch, and they have to be a little bit jealous of their time. Otherwise, it'll be party nonstop.
Well,
But
that
that's an
could
art they
easily
have to
happen.
learn.
Well, that's right, and as I know from the reading last night, I mean, this is a group of, there is a community here that loves literature, and that, and you know, people love to talk, and I think that is a balance that every writer needs. And even at a place like McDowell, you're still having dinner with everyone else at the end of the day, and but clearly, I mean, Jimmy clearly he wanted, even though this is an enclosed space, he is right on the main drag with all of these shops on Water Street, and so, I mean, as we were saying earlier, he was somebody who knew how to balance being alone and being with other people. You and I know another residency because you were the first Amy Clampett House resident. That I'll just mention this because Amy Clampett's house in Lenox, Massachusetts, that was not her idea. It was actually her husband. She died first. He wanted to use their house as a place to welcome writers and poets and literary critics. And it's similar in that to this residency, in that you're living with the poet's books. You're trusted to. It's part of the fun is to look through what were they reading.
There's also the Malay House
Right.
in New York, which does the same.
I've never been there, but that's right. That's a good example. It is part of the experience, to have, live in the, not just in the aura of this great writer, but also to look at their books and to read what they read. And marginalia study is in itself kind of fascinating and can lead to poems.
One of the things that I remember happened when Merrill died, one of his literary executors was our late friend and the neighbor here in Stonington, Sandy McClatchy. Yes. And Sandy was going through the books in the library, of which we can see there are thousands, and he said, I always knew that Jimmy was a graphomaniac. And this was the example I always use with students. He said he opened a volume of the complete poems of Dylan Thomas. You wouldn't think that that would be a poet with whom Merrill would have a natural affinity. And there on the frontispiece it said the complete poems of Dylan Thomas, block letters. And under the letters Dylan Thomas, Merrill had written in pencil, in block letters, hot ladies man. He couldn't look at the letters without making an anagram and changing them around.
I know. I'm just trying to remember some of the others. It's so funny you mentioned that. Neruda became unread. Nashville became unshaven, and there's some other part of it. But in any case, yeah, he couldn't help himself.
My sense is that people who go to residencies, most of them profit, especially people who are escaping from domestic responsibilities. Yes. If you have a job, if you have a family, if you have laundry and meals to prepare, then going somewhere else takes all of that off your plate. But I know there's some people, and one of the places of which this was true was Yado in Saratoga Springs. Some people go and they say, I can't stand it here, and they go home.
Yeah, no, I've never been able to understand that. I sympathize because it's not as if I've never been in a place where I can't write, but I never met a residency I didn't like. I mean, exactly for the reasons you say. And the longest I was ever at McDowell was close to 3 weeks. And I made a point of bringing 100% of my clothes so that I wouldn't have to do any laundry. That was very important to me, not one sock. And that was off the table. And one of the times I was, we think about deadlines. This was a birth line. I was pregnant with my second child, and my second book was due to my editor, and I spent that time at the residency, racing against time, trying to get it revised in time to go home and have the baby. And after that, I decided, no, I did want a third book, but not a third child. I couldn't keep on having children every time I had a book. But no, the more domestic responsibility you have, the more you value a place like this. And at the same time, as you say, it's a particularly important place for a young person who may not, in fact, have big domestic responsibilities, because the hardest thing when you're young is to believe that you really will publish that book. That, you know, you may have had some success with editors of magazines. Will you really publish a book? And will you really publish another book? And will anybody ever review you? You don't know that. You don't know it until it's retrospective. And in fact, these days, so little is reviewed that, you know, that might not happen no matter how well you write. But anyway, I think it's really important for young people.
I think we should end this because our time is drawing nigh. But one thing occurred to me, and that is when I used to be in my capacity as a literary editor, confronted with rooms full of eager, aspiring writers, some young, some not so young, I would say to them that there are 3 criteria for success. The first is talent. There's a lot of that to go around. The second is just sheer willpower, determination, and pluck. You get rejected, you send it out somewhere else. You keep going. And at the point at which you become dejected and stop, well, that's the end. And the third, and the most important of all, is luck.
Yes, yes.
So you have been, I mean, you have had all 3, but you've had luck.
Oh, I have.
Your first volume was published when you were still a very young woman.
Yeah, no, I think about this with my students all the time. It is harder and harder to have that kind of luck, although there are more venues because of the internet. Luck is still always a huge component in any literary life.
Are your students teaching you things about internet publishing that you've never had to know about or really don't care about?
I suppose I should care a little more about that aspect of it. What they do teach me is who they think is famous right now. And it's always some very young writer who's just beginning to publish. And they tell me, and I realize that I must not be set in my ways. I can't just go back to the people I always read and always teach. That there are, you know, young people writing right now who are doing things that I wish I could do and give me ideas for things I might try to do. So
you put me in mind of a story told me by a brilliant former student of mine from a couple of years ago who had a residency for 2 weeks at Skidmore in the writing program there. And he was assigned to a poet whose name I will not mention, and a very good poet whom we both know. And he, my student, said that he was very eager to write formal poetry and to write poetry with rhyme. And really, nobody was doing that, or people were not doing that anymore. And his teacher, the distinguished poet, said, well, of course it's done. Think of Elizabeth Bishop. And my student said, she died 40 years ago. So
oh boy.
Your sense of time changes.
You're so right.
What does contemporary mean?
Yeah.
40 years ago was another century.
Yeah, it's so true.
This has been great. This is Willard Spiegelman speaking to Mary Jo Salter in the bat-covered, wallpapered sitting room, parlor, at 107 Water Street here in Stonington, Connecticut. Thank you very much.
Thanks.